Welcome to Epic WW2 Tales, where the battlefield's echoes come alive through stories of courage, strategy, and fate. Today, we relive the moment when General Patton's unstoppable fury shattered the siege of Bastogne, and German Mockery turned to fear. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Where are you watching from? Let's get started. December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay silent beneath a cruel blanket of snow. The air was so cold that rifle bolts froze. Men's breath turned to mist, and the earth itself seemed to harden against mercy. The trees stood heavy with frost. The roads were treacherous sheets of ice, and somewhere among them, thousands of young soldiers waited, tired, hungry, and surrounded. This was the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last, desperate attempt to shatter the Allied advance and reclaim the initiative in the dying winter of World War II. The German army launched its counter-offensive on December 16th. It was sudden, violent and cunning. More than 200,000 troops surged through the Ardennes, catching the Allies completely off guard. The American front lines bent under the weight of the attack. Villages fell, roads were cut off, and chaos rippled through the frozen hills. Amid the confusion, one small town became the center of the storm, Bastogne. Bastogne was a crossroads. 7 roads led in and out of it, making it vital to any army moving through the Ardennes. The Americans knew it, and so did the Germans. If the Germans captured Bastogne, they could split the Allied forces and drive straight to Antwerp. If the Americans held it, they could block the enemy's advance and buy precious time. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division, was ordered to hold Bastogne at all costs. The paratroopers arrived exhausted and undersupplied. Many had been resting in France when the call came. They rushed into battle without proper winter gear, some even without helmets or heavy coats. The snow bit into their skin, and their breath froze on their rifles. But they dug in, around the edges of the town, in the woods, in trenches carved into the frozen ground. They were surrounded within days. By December 20th, the Germans had completely encircled Bastogne. No supplies could get in, no reinforcements could break through, and no retreat was possible. The men of the 101st Airborne were trapped. Ammunition ran low, food dwindled, and medical supplies were almost gone. The wounded lay in barns, the dying whispered for water, and yet morale remained strangely unbroken. The men of Bastogne knew what they were fighting for: each other. On December 22nd, a group of German officers approached under a white flag. They delivered a written ultimatum: surrender Bastogne or face annihilation by artillery. The note was formal, confident, even mocking. It spoke of the hopeless situation of the American troops and the futility of resistance. When the message was handed to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, he read it, frowned, and muttered one word: nuts. That single word, short, defiant, and entirely American, was typed out and sent back as the official reply. The Germans were confused. Nuts? They asked, puzzled. The American officer delivering the message smiled. It means go to hell. The message spread through the frozen trenches of Bastogne like wildfire. Soldiers laughed despite their hunger. They had no blankets, no food, and little hope, but they had pride. They weren't going to surrender, not now, not ever, but defiance alone could not stop the cold. Snowstorms cut off Allied air support for days. Paratroopers shivered in foxholes, their feet turning black with frostbite. The wounded begged for morphine that never came. German tanks rumbled closer every day. By Christmas Eve, the situation seemed hopeless. The Germans believed Bastogne was about to fall, and then came George S. Patton. While the men in Bastogne held their lines with sheer will, Patton was hundreds of miles to the south, commanding the U.S. Third Army. He was not a man who tolerated delay or excuses. When news reached him that Bastogne was surrounded, he didn't hesitate. He turned his entire army, 250,000 men, thousands of tanks and trucks, northward. In one of the most remarkable maneuvers in military history, Patton redirected 3 full divisions in less than 48 hours. His officers told him it was impossible. The roads were icy, the weather unbearable, and the men exhausted. But Patton's answer was simple: "We'll make it happen." Before the attack, Patton famously gathered his chaplain and ordered him to write a prayer for good weather, clear skies, so the Air Force could fly. The chaplain, somewhat hesitant, wrote it down: "Almighty God, grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee, that armed with thy power we may advance from victory to victory." Patton had thousands of copies printed and distributed to his men. On December 23rd, the skies cleared. The clouds broke, sunlight pierced the snow, and Allied aircraft roared over the Ardennes. They dropped food, ammunition, and medical supplies into Bastogne. Fighters strafed German positions. The men trapped inside could finally breathe again. To them, it felt like a miracle, but to Patton, it was simply the hand of destiny moving his way. On December 26th, the spearhead of Patton's Third Army, the 4th Armored Division, smashed into the southern outskirts of Bastogne. The siege was broken. American tanks and infantry poured into the town, greeted by paratroopers with frozen hands and exhausted smiles. They embraced each other like brothers. The nightmare was over, but the battle itself was far from finished. The Germans didn't simply give up. They fought with ferocity. The roads were clogged with wrecked vehicles, the snow stained with smoke and blood. The fighting raged through the woods and fields for weeks, but the tide had turned. The moment Patton's fury reached Bastogne, the momentum shifted irreversibly. The German soldiers, who had mocked the Americans for being trapped, now found themselves hunted and beaten back. The confidence that had driven Hitler's last gamble began to crack. Fear replaced arrogance. The Wehrmacht realized that their dream of victory in the West had died in the snow. For the men of Bastogne, survival had come at a terrible cost. Thousands were dead or wounded. Many had lost fingers or toes to frostbite. But they had held. They had faced the might of the German army, endured hunger, cold, and isolation, and they had not yielded. General McAuliffe and his men became legends. Patton's drive to relieve them cemented his reputation as one of the greatest field commanders in history. The victory at Bastogne wasn't just a tactical success. It was a symbol, proof that even when surrounded, outnumbered, and freezing, the human spirit could defy despair. In the days that followed, Patton visited the men of Bastogne. He looked around at the battered paratroopers, their faces hollow but proud, and said simply, "You men are heroes." To the reporters gathered nearby, he added, "A man must know his destiny. If he does, he can overcome anything." The German commanders who once mocked the Americans for being trapped had watched in disbelief as Patton's army tore through their lines. They had underestimated him, the brash, unpredictable general whose tanks rolled faster than their fear could spread. Patton didn't just rescue Bastogne. He crushed the myth of German invincibility once and for all. By January 1945, the German offensive was spent. Their fuel was gone, their morale shattered, and their troops retreating. The Bulge, that had once threatened to break the Allied line, was flattened. The road to victory lay open once again. For the civilians of Bastogne, liberation was both joyous and heartbreaking. Their homes were destroyed, their streets filled with ruins, but they were free. The townspeople who had shared their cellars and food with American soldiers wept as the tanks rolled through. They knew what it had cost. As for Patton, he would later write in his diary, "The relief of Bastogne was the greatest achievement of my career." It was not just about strategy or logistics. It was about speed, willpower, and audacity. He had done what others thought impossible. The Germans had mocked the Americans' plight, sending them ultimatums and threats. But in the end, it was the Germans who would taste fear, fear of a man whose fury moved armies through snow and steel, whose resolve broke their siege, and whose name became legend. The Siege of Bastogne remains one of the most iconic episodes of World War II, not just for its military brilliance, but for what it represented. Courage in the face of hopelessness, unity under fire, the unbreakable spirit of men who refused to quit. When Patton's tanks broke through that icy ring, the sound of their engines was more than a roar of victory. It was a promise that tyranny would not prevail, that freedom would not fall, and that even in the darkest winter, the fire of defiance still burned. And so, the world remembers Bastogne not as a place of defeat, but as a monument to endurance. The mockery of the Germans turned to silence, their laughter frozen in the snow, as the fury of Patton swept across the Ardennes and shattered their illusion of triumph. The Battle of the Bulge would end with over 80,000 American casualties, but it also marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. In that frozen forest, the tide of the war turned. Bastogne stood as the heart of the storm, and Patton's fury was the thunder that broke it. In the end, when history speaks of that winter, it doesn't whisper of surrender. It tells of men who held the line, a general who refused to wait, and an army that turned mockery into fear, forever etching the name Bastogne into the story of freedom. The snow melted, the guns fell silent, but the echo of that fury still lingers, a reminder that in the darkest moments of war, courage is the only light that never fades.